Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Canada Pavilion at COP15, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lauren Small, and I'm the Director of the Canada Pavilion for Environment and Climate Change Canada. Bonjour à tous. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue au Pavillon du Canada à la COP15 et merci de nous joindre aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Lauren Small, je suis la directrice pour le Pavillon du Canada avec l'Environnement et Changement climatique Canada. Just a few housekeeping items before we start this morning. If you could please turn your cell phones off or to put them on mute. Donc, si vous pouvez mettre vos téléphones cellulaires sur sourdine, ça serait apprécié. The panel this morning will be in English, but there will be a French presentation as well. Donc, il y aura une partie de la présentation qui sera en français et anglais. Donc, si vous avez besoin des écouteurs, c'est en arrière avec Nicolas. There is simultaneous interpretation headsets. If you need a headset, you can go see Nicolas. Just make sure to return them before you come back into the room. Thank you. And this is also ça serait enregistré. This will be a recorded presentation as well. C'est avec plaisir que je vous présente notre premier événement ce matin, Semences de changement. Mettre en évidence le rôle du Canada dans la restauration des forêts et des terres, organisé par le Service canadien des forêts qui fait partie des Ressources naturelles Canada. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our first event of the day, Seeds of Change, highlighting Canada's role in forest and landscape restoration, hosted by the Canadian Forest Service at Natural Resources Canada. The panel discussion will be moderated by Patrick Wiley. Patrick is a senior policy analyst with the International Model Forest Network Secretariat based out of the Canada Forest Service of Natural Resources Canada. Please join me in welcoming Patrick.
Thanks all, and thank you very much to the Canada Pavilion for hosting us here today. It's a pleasure to have folks. We know it's early on a Monday, and we really appreciate, given everything that's going on here in Montreal, that you're able to join us, so thank you. I'm going to rudely get up for 1 second and grab the clicker, which I forgot to leave on the in my hand, but is in the podium. And thought I'd welcome everyone here today, and first wanted to start with a land acknowledgement for that we're gathered here today in Jojagwe, or Montreal, the ancestral territory of the Janigiga Nation, and historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that we're gathered by many folks from the Canadian Forest Service and from partner organizations that are also on other ancestral territories, so we appreciate their work at home as well. We have quite a panel here today with us, and I want to first acknowledge the fact that when we thought about putting this panel together, we wanted to really highlight that the Government of Canada works in partnership. And so while the title of the session is about Seeds of Change, we really think of that in several different ways. And so when we started putting together a panel, we thought about the different initiatives that the Government of Canada is working on, that Canadians are working on for forest and land restoration. How can we exemplify how partnership allows us to get that done? And so we have a number of folks joining us here today, and I'll introduce people as they each come up. We're also going to be joined by Adriana Vidal, who's the chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration. So she and I are going to be co-hosting here today. She's currently helping things move forward in the negotiation space with briefing with one of the delegation groups, so she'll join us when she's available. So I think we can all agree that good progress here in Montreal on the overall framework is the most important piece, and so we're thankful that she'll be able to join us in a little bit. So maybe I thought we might, recognizing it's first thing on a Monday, we're going to have a panel. We're each going to speak for about 3 to 5 minutes. We thought we would start off, however, with a short curtain raiser video that we think might set the tone right. It's about a minute. And then we'll each have about 3 to 5 minutes. We'll introduce folks as they go, and then we'll have time for a round of questions and reflections from the panel before we wrap up around 11 o'clock. So if we're good to go, I think we'll switch over to the brief video for a second. Thanks. I know it's always a little bit weird watching a video that a few people may have seen before, but we wanted to set the tone by saying if we were to remake that video over the weekend, we would have added climate change and biodiversity to part of what 2 Billion Trees is working on. But part of the context of this panel is that it's not just about what we're doing on 2 Billion Trees domestically. There's a number of other efforts that are led by, not by the Government of Canada, through partnership with the Government of Canada, as well as internationally. And so that's the nature of the conversation here today. So I was thinking we might first go over to Cataline and maybe just introduce yourself. We can all introduce ourselves in our own voice, I think, here. You have 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll look forward to hearing your words.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Montreal. So my name is Cataline McAfee. I'm with the Canadian Forest Service and have been for over 15 years. I have a background in forestry and silviculture and have started working on restoration, say, about 10 years ago. And it's a very dynamic and evolving field. And I think one of the threats for our work on restoration is that it is always in partnership. We're not doing this alone. We're doing this with many, many partners. So some of the key files I've been working on for the last few years has been restoration projects in Alberta. And if you look at the picture behind me, so that person in the picture, especially on the left-hand side, is Michael Cody. He's one of our key partners, and I would say he's a mentor of mine, working for an energy company in Alberta. As I think many of you know, Alberta is home to many linear disturbances and seismic lines. Most of them, or many of them, legacy seismic lines that have a really hard time coming back to forest cover on their own. So people like Michael, and in collaboration with many other partners, are working on providing forestry tech or using forestry practices to help bring some of those seismic lines back to forest cover. So as you can see on your left, it's a large tree. It's doing really well, and that's that's partially happening because we've applied forestry techniques on those seismic lines. As part of the panel, I will be talking about some other initiatives we do as well. So I'm also the co-lead for the Habitat Restoration Working Group, which is part of the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium. A lot of our restoration work that we do as part of the Canadian Forest Service is in support of caribou habitat and other species at risk. So again, like, it's not just a simple we want to get trees back on the landscape, but it's for multiple reasons and multiple facets. Maybe I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it on to Len. Oh, yeah.
Yannick Shinwanwan in Squest Shukshuk. Good morning. My name is Lenny Joe, and I'm from the Shack and Indian Band in the southern interior, British Columbia. And my traditional name is Shukshuk, and it just means grizzly bear, name you give a man or a grizzly man. And I'm the new CEO for the First Nations Forestry Council in British Columbia and represent 205 Indigenous bands. And today, I just, being part of this panel and being able to come and use my voice and words to share where I came from and what we do. My slide actually is that I use this slide here is because my great uncle, Roy Palst, which just means blazing stone, and myself, Shukshuk Wells, it shows us doing the same practice where we're gathering food, and food security is very big in where we come from, and we're passed on with responsibilities to do the things that will guarantee our survival from here and into the future. One of the things is that we utilize the surroundings that we come from and the day-to-days of what is that world and what is reflected in that world and what do we need to survive. And one of the things that my grandfather, his name is Skielst, and he in 1978, when I was 8 years old, he sat us around and he said that he told us that if we're going to survive, we have to learn how to think like a white man. And it's when you're 8 years old, you don't really think about what that means, and he just said it, and then you carry that, and you carry that thought. And what he meant was that you have all the teachings, and you have the corporate memory where you come from, and you have everything that you need that we've given you, but the world is changing. The world is in constant movement and moving forward. And if we're going to survive, then and then as I grew up, I learned, okay, Western science. I became the first person in our family to go to university and get a degree in forestry. My degree's in conservation, but I found that the biggest impact was forestry, so I became a registered professional forester. The other things was also to listen and learn and to become part of things, because we have to understand each other. So again, going forward and doing things that that I can share from my culture, and also learn the Western ways of bringing that forward. And I don't think he realized how on the balance our language and culture and protocols and practices were on the verge of being taken over through the colonial system. And so really grateful that I was able to carry that forward and become part of what I call today the solution of moving forward. And so restoration, bringing things back, right sizing, and looking after our house. So my grandfather would say to us, if you're, he said, always look after your house. And that meant the water, the trees, the food, the medicine, the food security. He said, treat your guests well when they come to your house. But he said, but don't let them move the furniture. And that was that was his other line. And so what it is that we have guests in our house, and we have to look after our house, and we have that responsibility to do that. And I really am grateful that we've seen this, the seeds, and this is the seeds of change, is that in order for a seed to grow, it must be planted. But in order for you to plant your seeds, and that there also has to be a trust that it is going to grow. And you're going to see now, and part of my presentation today is that the Indigenous people realize that in order for everything for us to have certainty and security for our future, we must create an environment of trust where we can share our values so that they can move forward. Koksham.
Let's do that clicker.
And I'll send the clicker down in a second, but maybe this is a good moment just to welcome Adriana Vidal up to the stage. Adriana is the chairperson of the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration. And beyond that, I'll say that I used to work with Adriana when I worked at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So very pleased to be able to see you again after all these years, and very thankful that you're willing to co-host us with here today. So just as we go down and we maybe pick up the order again. So I'll pass the clicker down, just so you can do your own pacing. Then we'll go to Benoit after that, and then myself, and then we'll go to a round of questions. So thanks very much for the reflections, Len, and over to you.
Okay, hello everyone, I'm Tom Balfour. I'm a fish ecologist with Redfish Restoration, a Vancouver Island-based NGO that focuses on watershed restoration, post-forestry, and salmon and logging impacts. And I thought I would just kind of tell the redfish story here to kind of give you some context to our work and what we do and why we do it. So where I live and work on the west coast of Vancouver Island, it's impossible to disentangle the salmon from the people and from the forest. These things are far too tightly intertwined. Of course, in the ecological sense, our coastal temperate forests are some of the most rich and diverse ecosystems on the planet. And they owe a lot of this richness to the marine-derived nutrients that salmon have brought to them. And these salmon runs owe a lot of their productivity to the rich and diverse habitat created by coastal watersheds. And then on the human side, right, Indigenous people have harnessed this abundance since time immemorial to create thriving and complex cultures on the coast. And then modern-day Canada and modern-day BC owe a lot of its development to the extraction of fish and timber from the west coast. But of course, not all of this development was perfect or without consequence, right? Industrial logging, and especially in the early days, was not kind to fish and wildlife habitat. And as a result, up and down the coast, we have seen pretty widespread habitat loss related to forestry and other land use. And of course, salmon populations are not doing so well, and freshwater habitat loss is one of the main sources of that. it's practices like this in the Tranquil River and Clayoquot Sound, where you saw 90% of the riparian corridor removed in less than 10 years. It's these kind of practices that this sparked the war in the woods and the Clayoquot protests, right? So I live and work in Ucluelet, BC. Our community was at the heart of these protests. Very divisive time for our community, but a very important time in our nation's history about forestry. This was the biggest act of civil disobedience in our nation's history up until the Fairy Creek protests of last summer. And while a lot of great changes and protections came out of this work, or some of these protests, the changes and protections and the subsequent decline of salmon fishing opportunities in our region at the same time meant that a lot of our community was now out of work, kind of early 90s. So that's where Redfish comes in. We are founded as an NGO designed to put unemployed loggers and fishermen and members of the West Coast communities back to work in watershed restoration. And for over 27 years, we've done just that. Used watershed restoration as a tool for salmon conservation and recovery, and as well as economic and social development in kind of a post-resource landscape in these West Coast communities. So we take a very holistic approach to watershed restoration, working from the top down to address root causes of habitat loss and fish decline. These are things like road deactivation and landslide stabilization, riparian silviculture, in-channel restoration activities, but also acknowledging the social and economic side of restoration and what that can bring to these communities. I skipped too far. Our work is deeply collaborative by design. Each one of our projects is in partnership with one of the local First Nations in our region, who all hold a seat on our board of directors, and often in partnership with federal and provincial organizations and funding pots, like 2 Billion Trees Planted or the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund. Where is it going with that? I've lost my train of thought now. You're doing great. And I guess, so with this economic piece, like I think when NGO and community-based restoration sort of conjures these images of ma and pa and volunteer groups, which is time and place for that, but that's not what Redfish is about and advocating for. We're trying to push the field of restoration both technically and socially, and provide high-level jobs of all sorts of job opportunities in our region, right? From engineers and geologists to biologists to graphic designers and media folks. I'm really trying to capture that sort of robust opportunities that can come through restoration and restoration programs. And even so, our communities have kind of made a pretty miraculous transition to world-class tourism destinations. But that has not come without its own set of consequences, both ecologically and socially. And salmon are still not doing well, and in fact, it's worse than ever. So I think more than ever, organizations like ours and tools like watershed restoration are an important part of moving our communities forward in both the conservation and the social side of things. And then just generally in this biodiversity crisis that we're here to talk about, I think watershed restoration or whatever kind of habitat restoration is kind of one of our core tools, and for me represents maybe a bright spot going forward of some action-based stuff we can do now. Okay. Oh.
Thank you. Apologies, first of all, for being late, but you know how these things are in negotiations. Very unexpected, important meetings happen. All right, so Benoit, we know that you have been working here in Montreal with mobilizing citizens to restore areas, but you also have ample experience in other parts of the world, particularly in tropical forests. We want to hear more about how these different experiences contribute to your work here in Montreal, and what can you tell us about this, please?
Thank you, Adriana. Hi, my name is Benoit. As you maybe know, I'm the one who decided to give you some trouble in the morning by speaking in French because of two things. We're in Montreal, the heart of French language. Second things, it's maybe to give a little bit work to the translation team. So let's go. All right. Alors, mon nom est Benoît. Je m'appelle Benoît Tandin. Je travaille comme biologiste à la SNAP Québec, donc la Société pour la Nature et les Parcs. Merci pour cette belle image. Je vais revenir là-dessus. Alors, je vais vous parler de
back to that. So I will talk to you about our restoration project in Lille Saint-Thérèse, which is a project that we have built together with the community, as Adriana highlighted. So it was a new lung for the east of Montreal. Why have we chosen that name? Well, Lille Saint-Thérèse is an island territory located at the east of Montreal. It is a place at the east that is the subject to many issues. Atmosphere pollution, water pollution, because of the companies which are based at the east of Montreal, and something else that is at stake. The population lives with below the poverty line, and sometimes they cannot cope with these very high heat. How was the project born? In 2021, with the 2 billion trees project, we decided to take that opportunity to bring our contribution by doing something concrete in L'Île Saint-Thérèse, which is a site that has where people have mobilized for 10 years so to make it a natural park. So it's not SNAP Quebec that is working with us on this project in order to really to push that project forward. And during that project, we realized that it was good to create a park, but we had to think about diversifying the habitat so that in the future the park will be conducive to biodiversity, but also to nature in general. That's how our project was born. If we look at L'Île Saint-Thérèse, the main cause for degradation is agriculture. Formerly, it was land with very beautiful trees, but agriculture is to blame for the degradation of the territory. We looked at how to build a community project, and the community project is based on two elements. As I said, restoration, but also citizen mobilization. In 2021, we forested by involving 300 citizens. There were volunteers who came to lend a hand, and this year we planted 10,000 trees, and this year we had about 500 people who took part. So that's about 800 volunteers who are coming to lend a helping hand to the project. And our main goal is is by 2030 to plant 10,000 trees every year. So we realize that for those who like statistics, we're going to involve about 5,000 volunteers. It's a building project. We are involving the citizens to build something that is really magnificent. To come back to your issue earlier, Adriana, the project is it's a team project, but by coordinating this project, I really built upon my experience in Senegal, from where I'm from, where I had to build on reforestation in mangroves. And L'Île Saint-Thérèse today is a protected territory, and it was announced by the government of Quebec, the CMMs, to make it a beautiful park. So that is thanks to the funding we received from the federal government to implement this restoration project. And I think it's a project that we want to thank the government for. Thank you.
It's really inspirational to hear these actions that you are leading on, because you are mentioning these key elements to ensure impact and long-term sustainability. You engage with citizens, thousands of people mobilizing for this common cause for the environment, for their own community. So it's really great to hear. So now we want to hear perhaps a global perspective, but also with many stories of restoration that have also mobilized countries, jurisdictions, possibly, and for different reasons. So, Patrick, You told me that there has been investment from Canada on post-wildfire restoration in several countries. And not only that, but as a Canadian policy, these investments are focusing on many aspects that are cross-cutting and fundamental, such as gender, youth, and children. So this approach is quite interesting, it's wholesome, and we would like to hear more about it.
Thanks, Adriana, and thanks to all the panelists for setting up part of what's going on at home. And it's sort of an opportune spot to be in the speaking order to be last because I benefit from some of the visuals of others. But one of the things I reflect on with the International Model Forest Network is that we were actually born the exact same time. So June 12th, 1992 at the Rio Convention, at the Rio Summit, Canada announced they had launched the International Model Forest Network. So we're the same exact age as both the convention and our secretariat's the same age as well. And so I like to think that although the head of our secretariat, Rich Verbisky, isn't here with us today, Rich was there in Rio in 1992 when the Conservative government at the time made the announcement. And so lots of things have changed, but many have stayed the same. And so one of the things I think that stayed the same is that the Model Forest Network and what birthed the Model Forest Network was exactly what we were hearing about in Clayoquot Sound, the challenges that were happening in the landscape about how do we, concepts of land sparing and land sharing are not new. They've been going on for as long as time. And one of the things in the 1990s in Canada that was emerging was how are we going to move forward with balancing the needs of biodiversity, balancing the needs of habitat, jobs, and creation. And so what happened was a number of provinces and territories were invited to put forward across Canada examples where things were working. So there were about 60 examples that were put forward, and in Canada, about 13 of those were launched as model forests. And what that was trying to say, let's shine a light on where collaboration, participatory development is working. How can we move forward about how to use our land collectively? And so that was in 1992, and I think the idea was a bit novel at the time, but the idea was to then scale that up and see how it works in different locations. And so by shining that light and taking those examples that were being raised in Clayoquot and now again are around in Fairy Creek, a lot has changed, but a lot of the drivers are the same. And so we at the Model Forest Secretariat are trying to, I guess, do two things, and we're very pleased today to be able to say that some of you may have heard earlier today that there are a number of announcements that Canada are making. Encourage you to come back by this space around 12:30 later today, that there may be interesting things to hear. But earlier today, Minister Wilkinson and Natural Resources Canada and the Government of Canada announced $18.7 million over the next 4 years internationally to work with the Model Forest Network and support countries and partners to advance forest and landscape restoration action. So moving beyond plans and ideas and actually moving towards putting those seeds of change forward, not just tree planting, but all types of landscape restoration. And I thought I'd give one example for us here of some work that we've already been doing with colleagues in Latin America. Behind me, you see the breadth and strength of the network that we have of what was originally a seed of change in 1992, has grown to a network of over 60 model forests in 30 countries on 5 continents. And Canada, you'll see, is actually the smallest number of model forests there compared to many others. Half of our network is in Latin America. So I thought by maybe just taking a very quick peek into Latin America, and we'll get to some examples. We promised to not use slides and use pictures. Technically, this is a picture. What I want to point out is in Latin America, in the response to the wildfires in Brazil and the Amazon, and then later in Bolivia in the Pantanal, shared with Paraguay, and then in Guatemala, the fire year of 2019 in Latin America was massive in context. Fire in landscapes, as we know, is not a danger. It's an integral part of landscapes and ecosystems. So the question is, how do we survive? How do we balance and share and thrive in those landscapes afterwards? And so the Government of Canada committed through the G7 funds to support forest and landscape restoration in fire recovery areas. And the focus was on strengthening the role of women, boys and girls in that role. And so in 1 year, it was actually 3 months. So between December 26th, I think, is the first contribution agreement, and the end of March, partners in 8 countries in Latin America were able to, in just 3 months, put together the results you see on the screen behind you. Monitoring stations, we were able to fund both graduate students and technical training, and a number of different examples. That's now grown from an initial just over approximately $2 million in the first year, has now been almost $8 million to date. And so, although the money that we're announcing today of the $18.7 million over the next 4 years, that fund isn't related specifically to fire and recovery, but it is to still work on gender equality across all the aspects of our forest and landscape restoration work. And when I say we, I say that truly as the secretariat of the Model Forest Network, where we work for our members. Those are governments, NGOs, international organizations, local citizens groups at the table working on local ideas that they bring forward. We're a conduit to help scale up their voice and bring it to places like here in Montreal. We're always there to help support them. We're pleased to be able to do that financially over the next 4 years and help really scale up those seeds of change and help bring them forward into other types and hopefully bring some of their examples on a slide like this. Hopefully there'll be a framework by then. Hopefully there'll be a framework by the end of this week. But we can start bringing some of those voices and new examples to subsequent meetings. Thanks, Adriana.
Thank you, Patrick. And this actually feels very close to the work we do at the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration. For the ones that you don't know about it, the GPFLR is a voluntary partnership of 36 member organizations, a mix of governments, NGOs, think tanks, UN organizations who are all working together to support and scale up, expand forest and landscape restoration across the world. So what Patrick mentioned, what Canada is doing is, of course, something that we want to follow up and replicate elsewhere as well. So this GPFLR community also allows us to learn from others the successes and how things are done that are working and how to perhaps create synergies in the countries we're operating and collaborate. So this is really great. Of course, it is impossible to know the depth of the work of your organizations in 3 minutes, in a 3-minute pitch. So we're trying to go a little bit deeper into the things that you have illustrated before with a few questions for all of the panelists. So the way this is going to work, and probably Patrick already explained, there are 2 rounds of questions just to allow panelists to share more with us. So we're going to go in reverse order, I believe, or in a different order, just to mix things up. Let's start with Kathleen. Yes. So you talk about the work that you're doing in forest surveys, and I'm sure that there are different perspectives on how restoration is implemented. But can you tell us more about this? What are these approaches, or what is restoration for you, for your institution, and how do you do it?
Thanks, Adriana. So as I alluded to earlier, for us, restoration and the work that we do on restoration is always in partnership. So we work closely with other organizations. And I think I'm going maybe a little off script and not necessarily answer directly your question, but I think what I would like to do is provide some examples of some of the work that we have been doing and that we have been involved in. So as I mentioned earlier, we have worked closely with many organizations, mostly perhaps in Alberta, to help address some of their challenges with restoration of seismic lines. One project in particular that I would like to talk about is a project we did several years ago with Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. And again, it was very collaborative, so they were one of our partners, but we also worked with local communities. We worked with external organizations as well. But what we as you may know, so seismic lines, there's thousands of kilometers seismic lines in Alberta, and they don't tend to regenerate on their own, many stagnant lines. So as I mentioned, we are applying forestry techniques to help restore those sites. The energy sector has a lot of workers they're very, very familiar with how to put those lines in, but there's not a lot of expertise and knowledge on how to apply those forestry practices correctly. So what we've done with this collaborative project, we've developed tools, or not necessarily tools, but we've developed products that really help visualize on how to apply those forestry techniques on the land base. So through a range of fact sheets and videos and even guidebooks with more in-depth information, we really hope to help the energy sectors and others that work on the land base, including land managers, on how to apply those forestry techniques and really increase the rate and precision of return to forest cover, and to that extent to really help that forest landscape restoration and reduce the impact on the land base. As I mentioned as well, a lot of our work is in support of caribou habitat. Again, so we work a lot with the people on the ground to make sure that we do it right. The other example I would like to talk a little bit about is our Habitat Restoration Working Group. So some of you may be familiar with the National Boreal Knowledge Consortium, which is led by Environment Canada. So I'm with Natural Resource Canada, but we work very closely with Environment and Climate Change Canada. So the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium has several working groups as part of that organization, and I'm the co-lead for the Habitat Restoration Working Group. And again, it's a very collaborative working group. So we have representation from the federal and the provincial governments, from ENGOs, from academia, from the forest sector, from the energy sectors, and others. And collectively, we're trying to support land managers, provinces, others, to help them, again, improve their restoration outcomes. So this is a very national organization or a national working group, which also makes it very challenging because we tend to work on the land base. And as you know, Canada is very, very big. So we wanted to develop some practical tools to help land managers with their restoration efforts. The first step that we have done so far, we have developed an ecological model that really provides some advice and direction on how to, and that includes pathways, and that helps decision making when it comes to restoration. There's a lot of information on this ecological model available online. If you Google or if you find CCLM portal, there's a lot of, we have, again, fact sheets. The model is there. There's technical report there as well. But some other examples that maybe I can briefly talk about is there's in the works they're trying to develop a center of excellence for restoration in support of caribou and carbon. Again, it's for now they're hoping to set up a demo site in 2024 in Alberta. It's again very collaborative with industry, Indigenous communities, ENGOs, and I think I just would like to mention that because there will probably be interest across Canada as well. So it's really founded in science. So they're really trying to set up more trials. They're trying to set up a demonstration site. But again, it's founded to make sure that it's not just a demonstration site and we show some techniques where they will continue to improve or initiate novel and new ideas. But again, make sure it's the real trials. The last one that I may want to mention is the 2 Billion Trees program, and it has been mentioned before by several organizations. And the 2 Billion Trees program, it's not just a program to plant trees. There's also a science component to it. So one of the science projects, or several of the science projects that we are working on, is to try to make sure that people that do plant trees and organizations that do plant trees, that they get support and help in understanding where to plant the right trees. And I think with climate change, it's all becoming so much more complicated. And it's not just simply putting trees in the ground, but you want to make sure that the trees have a high rate of survival for many years to come. And for more information on the science programs and our science initiatives, I would suggest you look on the Canadian Forest Service website. And I think maybe I'll leave it at that, if that answers your questions, sort of.
Yes,
Adriana.
absolutely. And I mean, it's fascinating to see how you're bringing science, you're bringing groups to contribute to the creation of this knowledge, guidelines to implement at scale this restoration of habitats. And one thing I wonder is how how does one make the connection between this scientific work and the guidelines with partners and communities that are traditional stewards of land? So we have Leonard here, and we would love to hear more about how is this connection done, how both communities and partners that are, as I said, traditional stewards, traditional knowledge, how does that contribute to the generation of science and ultimately implementation?
Thank you. Where to start? When you think of Indigenous communities and you think of the Indigenous people, every product that comes from Canada comes off of someone's traditional land. And you'll hear that, and we're starting to see and recognize that even more. You're hearing a lot of partnerships. You're hearing a lot of First Nations working with organizations and becoming part of the solution. You don't see everything that's happening in the background. You don't see the years of what the current state or the past state has done to our communities. There's this newness that's coming right now, and it's a revitalization of who we are as a people. And the pride and the language, the customs, the protocols that are coming back. I want to go back. I'm from British Columbia, and so in BC, we've been working on revitalizing and gaining a voice. You'll always hear, oh, the First Nations will come and they'll pound their fists on the table, demand the rights to be at the table, to have a voice. In British Columbia, 2019, we just got DRIPA, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. It passed legislation. It became a law. It's against the law now to not include Indigenous voice in the laws, past, current, and future. I think that's the first step that you got to take. If you don't have Indigenous people sharing and creating, then the laws that you have don't truly reflect all the people that are on that land. And so if you can't change the laws, then you can start in your boardrooms. You can start in your organizations. You can start in your communities. And I think that's the responsibility that everybody has to have and take. And then what you got to do is, if you're going to do that, create an environment to build the capacity. Like I said on my first, I have one slide. I said that we had to learn how to think like a white man, and I don't say that in a bad way. I think I think like a pretty good white guy, for being in Tlakatlm. And at that point, it created an environment where you have to trust and you have to share. And if we're going to battle anything that is happening right now, we need everybody. We do need everybody. And we actually need to go back to the current owners of the houses that we all live in to learn what it takes to look after that house. The other thing now is the environment that my great uncle White Pals had is not the same. There is a lot of carbon coming. There's a change in the climate. We have to look after things of what we're doing for food security. So I was, we're talking about programs and plans that we're doing. In my backyard alone, I wrote down 17 initiatives that we're working on as the Nlaka'pamux people. Right from the 2 billion trees, wildfire rehabilitation and recovery, zero net growth of roads, harvesting practices, old growth, old forest management, cultural survival area management strategies, forestry legislation reform, introduction of cultural and prescribed burning, forest landscape planning, new fiscal framework, guardian programs, compliance and enforcement, revitalized culture and language, First Nations 10-year reform, partnerships with forest license holders, forest certification bodies, carbon sequestration, and fiber utilization. Every one of those takes warm bodies. Every one of those takes a commitment and a responsibility. And so a lot of the times people want our participation, but they don't recognize and realize that there's only so much capacity and there's only so much dollars. So when we're doing our programs and projects and doing our forestry tenures that we're doing, we're actually creating own source revenue to participate. British Columbia now has DRIPA. British Columbia is now working on shared decision making, increased tenures, increased participation, and all these things that need to be done so that we can be effective participants in finding the solutions that's going to save all of us. And so I think with what I'm here is that I have 205 Indigenous First Nations that I work with as the CEO for the First Nations Forestry Council, 35 different languages and dialects in the province of British Columbia. Every one of those people and nations totally have a real corporate memory and understanding of their backyard. And so, you think of that richness of information that is out there, and we need to create the environment so that we can share it. And so that's what gets me on a plane to come to Montreal and share the story with you beautiful people. Kuksham.
Thank you so much. This has been very inspiring. Thank you for putting in our minds all of these realities that we are talking a bit. I mean, we're very much focused sometimes into concepts, but let's all remember that at the end of the day, this is happening in our lands, and it is impossible to do this without Indigenous people, traditional knowledge, who are intrinsic part of all of this. And you said it, as you fairly said, is in the traditional lands that they own. And I also rescue from your intervention the motivation, the way you explain things. It really makes me think about how people get motivated to be part of these processes, whether it's at the political level, at the grassroots level, to really ensure that ecosystems are restored for their own livelihoods, for their own realities. And earlier we heard from Tom your story, your experience about what gets you excited about the things that you do, all of this restoration and the videos you're producing and other activities. So from your perspective, why is it important? What is your motivation to continue working on this day to day?
Personally and selfishly, it's fish. I love fish. I love fishing for them. I like hanging out with them. And I would like it if there was more of them. But I think that's, so my work focuses primarily on fish and wildlife that come from all that. And I think, for me, that is the motivation. And the hands-on approach. I like, policy change is great, and lobbying and activism are critical tools of all of this. But I quite enjoy going out every day and physically building fish habitat or thinking about fish habitat, fundraising for fish habitat. And then the salmon thing, like, for those of you not from the coast of BC or a salmon place, it's really hard I can't overemphasize how important salmon are to everyone. Indigenous connection, of course, we won't ever be able to kind of comprehend or understand that closeness. And then in non-Indigenous communities too, right? Like, everybody fishes, everybody's 2 degrees of separation from someone who made their living or continues to, or at least eats fish, or just is proud of fish and BC. And for me, that like it pulls it all together. And of course, the salmon is just sort of our vehicle, and being a keystone species, it's an easy one. We have to pick one, but the goal is healthy deer, bears, humans, eagles, the whole process. But for us, it's nice to pin it on the fish, and then without them, we wouldn't have any of this. And I think that is just my motivation, and it's cool because some of these ecological issues in forestry, it gets controversial and it can divide your communities. But I find I've been doing this for 11 years now, and salmon seems to be non-political. It seems to be from all spectrums, from the West Coast rednecks to the activists, to just day-to-day folks. Everybody loves and appreciates fish, and can appreciate cleaning up after your mess too, right? The concepts are fairly simple in theory. The practice of restoring watersheds is complicated, but yeah, I quite like that it goes beyond politics. It touches people in that nice way, in a way that I don't know, it resonates broadly, and I quite enjoy being a part of that.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, thank you for sharing this excitement, this motivation that is behind your work, and I'm sure that is shared by the many partners and actors that you work with every day. And speaking about partnerships, we also have Benoit here, who, in order to achieve all of the things that you mentioned before, you must work in partnerships. That's fundamental. So we want to hear more about this, how restoration has been facilitated, improved, scale up, etc., through partnerships.
All right, thank you, Adriana. Alors, il faut d'abord un peu peut-être recamper un peu. J'aime bien ces questions qui sont posées. C'est quoi la restauration? Parce que on peut planter des arbres, mais sans nécessairement faire de la restauration. Donc pour faire de la restauration, dis-je bien, c'est important de penser d'abord en amont qu'est-ce véritablement.
It's important actually to do restoration, and in our project the cause is agriculture. We have empty territory, and we want to bring tree planting, and this will allow the wildlife to have some habitat with trees that would come and contribute to diversification. In order to do the restoration project, it's possible to not intervene and let nature do it, and sometimes nature, if it's really deeply damaged, then we can intervene with planting project. So to do the project, we need to think of it, but partnerships are very important because restoration costs money. So money means people intervening. So the planning aspect is important, and that's what we tried to do with the people who are around our site. And these people are the real beneficiaries of the project. As I said, we really we want to create cool islands in this area. And so we have the cities, we have the ministries that are with us also, and we have academics also with us for restoration. It's important to have academics contributing because the species of trees need to be properly chosen and planted in the right place. So it's important for the soil. She also mentioned the monitoring and the follow-up, because we won't just plant trees and abandon them. We need to follow them, follow up. What are the benefits? Do they do carbon sequestrations, and are they okay for restoration? vision and for all our efforts, like in Canada and Quebec. So we really rely on mobilizing citizens and all actors in order to have a community project, really.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to hear until the end. Thank you so much. Absolutely. You have mentioned, in a nutshell, basically everything that needs to be taken into account when we talk about partnerships, and also partnerships for what, right? It comes across from top to bottom, and in both ways, including many, many different actors. And this perspective of who do we involve, who do we work with to really to make restoration success a success can be brought by, you know, by Patrick, because he works with many, many countries through his role in the network and in Canadian government. So you have plenty of experience working with different stakeholders and partners. So can you tell us from this perspective, really at the end, who's restoring these landscapes, these forests? How is it done? And we'll be happy to hear from examples in Canada or abroad.
Yeah, thanks. And so when I reflect on the Secretariat's experience on working for 30 years on sustainable forest management, and I'll preface by saying that somewhere between a clear cut and a Category 1 protected area is a livelihood, and there's many livelihoods that preceded the geographic lines on a landscape, and there were many lives that were impacted through the process of that, and there are many lives that are involved every day in the administration of those areas. And so when I think about who's doing the work, I think a lot of the time in the Model Forest Network, we talk about action beyond words. I mean, I'm guilty of generating brackets. There's lots of lanyards on the back of my door from different times over my relatively short career. But I think decision makers are sometimes thought about to be in this space. And I think the reality is that decision makers are the ones, the hearts, minds, hands, and feet that really are making everyday decisions on the landscape. And those aren't necessarily driven by a side event pavilion space, or they're not necessarily driven by a funding announcement. They're driven by what advances their local priorities. And that could be in a local watershed, that could be on a local piece of land that they're a tenant to, or a piece of land that they don't have access to anymore that was part of their historical way of accessing the house that you're mentioning. But I think of well as tenant owners on land in Latin America, where the back part of their piece of land is actually the savings account for those shocks in the economic system. And so when I think about who's going to be doing the work, if we were here 15 years ago, forestry would not have multiple events on one day. It would be a very small part of the broader landscape, and you definitely wouldn't have a minister or funding announcements around it. So I think forests have arrived on the international agenda, for better or for worse, however you view it. And I think the question now is who's going to do the work. And so that's part of why we're focusing on, you know, the head of the network, the International Secretariat was there at Rio in 1992. 10 years from now, he probably won't be at the next COP at COP 20, or we're in climate COP, so divide by 2. So, you know, at a COP 20 or so, you know, the head of the international network probably won't be there. So that's why we're focusing on trying to equip the next generation of forest leaders. The voice is there, the need is there. In some places, the money is starting to flow. So the question is, who's going to do the work? And that isn't necessarily generating people in suits. That also isn't necessarily just only generating people that are actually able to do work on the land. But that full spectrum in between, I think, is what we need. And I think that's why, two last thoughts, Adriana, I guess, from my side would be, I think that's why things like generation restoration are so important under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, focusing on creating that next cohort, getting that sort of energy there, and really creating, I think it was Andrew Steer at WRI who first started talking about some of those ideas many years ago, but I think that's an important part. I know the advisory committee is meeting today on the UN Decade. But the second is just to say that we very often use all types of forests. We refer to all types of forests, but the topology in Canada is going to be very different from even northern or southern Ghana, depending on what part of the country you're standing in. And so we often talk about just tree planting, but I think things like the IUCN Restoration Barometer or the Restoration Report that was launched today, and the topology, thinking about even within hedgerows, trees on farms, how we use sustainable silviculture management for pruning and thinning in some types of forests, fire restoration, all these different pieces. It's not just about tree planting. That takes 3 years just to get a seedling to be ready to put in the ground. How do we work with the landscapes that we already have, and who's going to do that? I think it's going to be the next generation of forest leaders.
Thank you, Pat. So I have another set of questions, but I want to give the floor to the audience, just for a change. Do you have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Donnie McPhee. I'm the coordinator for the National Tree Seed Centre of Canada. And in being such, I realize and I'm quite in tune with the need for seed, for appropriate seed sources, for land reclamation. And I'm just wondering, in any of your projects, is that something that's coming up? So appropriate seed sources from appropriate species to do the work you need to do.
Thank you. Does anyone want to answer that? Any? Yep.
Sure. Thank you for that question, actually. In British Columbia, of course, everyone sees there's seed banks and there's a way of seed collection, and it follows a process. And so I'll add my little take on this is that you get your Class A and Class B seed, and you've got this process that you follow, and there is or I should say there was enough seed until we got hit with the mountain pine beetle, and then we had to really do some catch up and understanding of things. So any changes in the environment, I've seen that there have been influxes and challenges to seed. And but the other one was that the whole seed program in British Columbia didn't have any oversight or inclusion of decision making from Indigenous people. And then local seed sourcing was more so, an Indigenous thought of local seed sourcing was more local seed sourcing, and the idea of that these seeds came from parents that were here, not from here, right? So I think that but it is a big. It is a big issue that we are working on locally in the Intlagam territory of seed sourcing and proper seed sourcing, and where does it go? And again, that now has to follow some form of a process. So I also work in the forest industry. I'm a professional forester. I work for you name a big company. I was there, but I also sit on certification body called Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and one of the things with that again is and why I do that is I think it is a responsibility. Everyone has a responsibility, and there needs to be avenues and ideas of how to not only identify responsibilities, but how do you make that actionable, and how do you create that environment where people will be able to source that information and in lack of a better words, come up with a plan that's there and for them to follow. And so I think that seed sourcing is definitely one of the highlights that can be brought up into a certification body, but it's also one of the things that whatever level it's at, it has to have an Indigenous oversight and shared decision making where that comes from. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Anyone else wants to add something? Otherwise, we'll ask for another question from the floor. No? Does anyone have another question? Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to actually thank Pat for his comments about it's who's going to do things on the ground, and also the recognition that we need to be looking to the next generation to take care of things. And I was just wondering if you could expound on that a little bit more in terms of how you think that could be meaningfully implemented to facilitate the next generation of implementers, decision makers, and Indigenous relationship builders.
Yeah, so thank you for the appreciation of other people. And I think that's where a lot of this starts. So maybe three just off the top reflections would be, one, I think that building, capacity building, and knowledge, not sharing, but knowledge development into restoration programming. So if that's the science aspects of 2 billion trees or the capacity building stream of the call for proposals, including, you know, the ongoing nature and the adaptive nature of the 2 billion trees and the announcements recently, I think that's one place, is to not just look at funds for on the ground, but how to sustain those. And maybe that transitions to a second. Benoit mentioned, you know, about the process of restoration or entering, and I like that part of how IUCN, the global partnership, frames, you know, 10 years ago it might have been tracking the number of hectares of commitments, but now it's really about tracking how many hectares are under the process of restoration, because it takes time to get things back into the natural cycle, and a tree today is a gamble on the future climate and where we're going. So I think talking about that process of ecosystem restoration and being under it is there. But I guess being a bit more tangible about the who and how do we equip. A personal reflection. Maybe it's a guilty admission in a climate COP, but I have a background as a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from the University of New Brunswick. That was the oldest forestry program in Canada, and that's shifted now. You know, it's no longer a forestry degree program. It's a natural resource program. We've seen that with forestry and University of Toronto. UBC is still going strong, and there's a number of still forestry schools in Canada. But I graduated with 120 foresters or potential foresters in training. 5 years later, that was about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, then it was 30, then it was 5. Who's going to do the work of putting a stamp on a restoration plan, or more specifically on a forest management plan, or a certified biologist, or who's going to be running the electrofishing to do salmon habitat surveys? You know, those are the sorts of skill sets, not just, I don't have leather-soled shoes on, I could bring my cork boots in, I could bring my still 650 thinning saw out that I still have from my time as a pre-commercial thinner. You know, I have all those tools, but I think we need to encourage people to be in forests in general, all types of forests, whichever they are. And I'll just say as a last thought on it, the model forest of Newfoundland and Labrador has some of the best eco-programming to encourage people to get into forests, forestry. Just get out in a machine, get out in a set of boots, find a way to be an outfitter. Just have a connection to land. Whatever it is, then we'll find different ways. It doesn't matter what degree program you are, or tech training, or background. Find a way to have your feet closer to soil.
Great. Yes. I just want to complement this answer with some of the things that are happening at the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and I'll then ask our participant to ask the next question. But so these things have been, of course, being thought from a systematic point of view, like how do we change society to be more, so more and more youth are not only involved, but also knowledgeable and motivated to join this restoration movement. And the idea, at least the aspiration, is that Decade partners are the ones who are developing the curriculum in universities or even high schools programs. How do we raise this, not even awareness, but, well, let's say awareness of the importance of starting from that small level up to universities to bring people on board? I think in the last, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years, the presence of youth and students has been growing around restoration. And you can see more and more forums where these youth members exchange, and they want answers, and they not only are eager to find answers, but they are eager to implement, even within their own communities. And many times they are lacking of what Patrick is saying. Okay, how do we do this? Who's going to lead us into the technical aspects of it or in the financing part of it? So I guess that each of us from where we are can also think, how do we contribute to these groups that are very, very eager to make a change? Please.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, I'm Matt from Canada's National Observer. Obviously, there's a lot of talk around Indigenous participation. Controlled burns or fire was kind of an ancestral technique for forest management and forest restoration for a lot of Indigenous peoples. So I'm just wondering, what is the status or conversations around control burning for forest management?
Thank you. Anyone? Leonard? Everybody's looking at you.
Thank you for that. Fire is part of the land. Fire is more natural than almost anything else that we do to the land. And so there is a need for fire. It was used to control even the spacing in a forest for certain mushrooms. Is meant for our berries, is meant for medicine. So fire was a natural part. In British Columbia, they're actually changing legislation now with First Nations and Indigenous people in the room on incorporating fire, not only for the cultural burning, but also prescribed fire for forestry once again. And so you're starting to see that, and you're starting to see that need for it. And it will take a lot of time because, one, we're in a very changed environment. Number two, we've got past practices where we did a very good job. And I'll say British Columbia had a really good job of firefighting, which now has created some fuel loading. So it's a very different environment that we need to move into. And that is where I shared earlier is that it's going to take all of us, because for us to get our house back in order, we need to have that help of science and everybody to be able to get to the right size of that again. But I do look forward to that of seeing what the use of fire and the fire. In my community, we have the Salish firekeepers, and we're utilizing the Salish firekeepers with the BC Wildfire Service, working collaboratively with them. We've actually developed our unit crews again, and British Columbia is investing into wildfire fighters from communities. But with the Salish firekeepers, the BC Wildfire, and other biologists and scientists are actually working together to create a program of being able to bring back fire and working with our guardians. So it'll be very interesting to watch, and I encourage everyone to just keep watching British Columbia. We will probably stumble, and we will probably fight, and people will pick their stories that they want to place. But if you can't get in a room and say the hard things that need to be said, then they won't be said, and we won't move forward. Chuck.
Thank you. And actually, this question makes me think of that we are in a great space to share best practices and challenges. So in the last part of our event, I think we have 15 minutes maybe left. I would like to hear from you. You have very different perspectives and of course, a wealth of experience. Can you share with us some of these best practices and challenges? Because one doesn't go without the other, right? In the process of reaching the best way of doing things, you have to overcome certain challenges. So it'll be great to hear from you. Why don't we start by Benoit, and then we go through in that order. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Your Adriana. Les défis en général au niveau de la restauration.
So generally speaking, in terms of restorations, challenges are multiple because we can always run into surprises. If I take my case at the Sainte-Thérèse Island, we decided to implement the the project. We looked at all the prior studies that we had to carry out, but we've been confronted to a mice attack from the first day. They have started nibbling at our tree plantings, so we had to anticipate. These are situations that we anticipate. These are mice we hadn't seen when we were staking out the site in order to quickly place spirals and save our seeds, our seedlings. That's also an island that has lots of animal diversity, particularly the Virginia deer. So we also had to set up a protection mechanisms in order to safeguard the young trees. So yes, the restoration we of course we can do upstream. There's also realities on site that makes that ensure that sometimes it's hard to anticipate. One of the issues that we run into, it's invasive species on the island, particularly the common willow that is growing very quickly. Here, I have a background in science, so I went to get information how we could fight, how could we plant trees, quick growing trees, very quick to these in order to compete in the space to this willow species, and how the shade of our indigenous species would hinder the growth of these invasive species. This is a evaluation that we are leading that year after year with the follow-up that we're doing, the monitoring that we're doing. We have to deal with challenges that we had not envisioned at the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that practice. Tom?
Yeah, for us in the world that I work in, I guess a big part of the best practices is learning from your past mistakes. So, our organization started at a time when we hadn't ever had to repair a coastal watershed that had been completely clear cut. So it's all a big experiment, and we've learned a lot through the 30-something years our organization has been doing that. And I think one of the biggest pieces in our trajectory that we've learned is when you're looking at restoration, whatever it is, watershed, forest, it's to target your approach to the processes that made that place so ecologically rich and diverse. Like we can go in and make a river look kind of nice and neat and how it used to, but without addressing the core watershed processes that created and maintained habitat, that is not going to persist. And it's the idea of giving these places the tools they need to thrive on their own, right? Our work, we try and set these watersheds up for kind of long-term self-sustaining success. And part of that is working at multiple time scales, right? We have this crunch of salmon going extinct before our eyes, so we don't have the time it takes, right? In our watersheds, what the recovery is going to come from from big trees coming back, right? The current state of these small second growth forests in the watershed, they do not have the size or the structure needed to create and maintain habitat in coastal watersheds. So the real savior for our situation is going to be the recovery of large trees. And so that's where a lot of our tree planting and silviculture work comes in to speed up that process. But it's hundreds of years out, right? So we acknowledge that, and we do a lot of that kind of work setting up for long-term success. But we also have to do, what can we do now to create habitat that can be used and keep the species going? And so that's a lot of our in-stream work, physically making habitat and putting log jams back in. But I think, yeah, so it's acknowledging the process piece and the time scales you're working with, and then all the social stuff that I talked about in my intro there, I think is sort of our best practices. And then challenges is getting money and keeping money. And I guess my last piece is our approach is this long-term commitment to restoration. We're very focused on our region and not walking away from the watersheds. I find a lot of time in this field and our world that it's a consultant will come in, do a project and leave, and that's restored. But it's such an endlessly evolving project, and a lot of our Indigenous partners really harp on that you guys don't go anywhere. You keep funding that project, you keep working, and once you're happy with it, you keep monitoring it, and you look for repairs. And that's this idea of stream keeping and real long-term stewardship. So I think that's, the kind of core piece there.
Yes, these are key elements, absolutely. I am taking mental note of this because we need to bring these best practices and experiences to the rest of the world. And I have an idea for later, but please, Leonard, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of exciting things going on, and literally minutes to talk about it. So in my community, we have the Nicola Valley Institute of Technology, and it's owned by the 5 Intellecam bands, or the Nicola bands, as we call it. And one of the things that I like right now is I'll stick with fire, is that we are working with the province on developing the firekeeper and cultural burning and prescribed burning, how to merge and implement it at a provincial level, that it does get signed off by a registered professional forester, but it has the input and background of our cultural and prescribed burners. So actually it gets signed off by someone from the firekeepers as well. And so it's kind of neat to be able to work collaboratively for the solutions that we need today. The challenge is the same thing, is that everything right now is project based. You write an application and you might get funding, and you'll get funding for so long, right? And so what we're seeing now is that it does take long-term investment, and it is a process that will take long-term monitoring and tweaking, and it'll be live. And so I see that as definitely one of the needs that we need to look at, and have that ability to find the solutions, but also to be able to truly invest into those solutions as we move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely long-term investment.
Thank you. So maybe I'll focus on some of the work that we've been doing in Alberta. And I think some of the biggest challenges, well, maybe I'll focus on the positive first. Like, I'm always really impressed with how much people want to do and how much people like to, really put efforts into it. But the sheer size and the amount of seismic lines, for example, that need to be restored, we're talking like hundreds of thousands of kilometers. And it's still like we're in a natural environment. Like, it's not like one size fits all. So what may work for a few kilometers, then maybe the landscape changes and you have to switch gears. So I think one of the biggest challenges for us is, like, how can we scale up? Average to restore 1 kilometer is about $10,000. So maybe 2 of us said before, cash is definitely a big challenge. But it's how are we creating ways to scale up our restoration practice, and how can we really make sure it's like we can start addressing some of those issues?
All of you are leaving us with big questions, huh? All right, Patrick,
well,
your turn.
Maybe as we get towards the close, I'll say that I toyed with giving my entire speaking slot to a 6-minute video that we just launched on imfn.net, or rimfn.net, or ribm.net, depending which language of your 3 choices you want, where folks are trying to talk through exactly how they see this moving forward. But in the Model Forest Network, we commit to learning not just from our successes, but from our setbacks and challenges. And if we took every pilot, and it's a word I hate, and maybe the project funding basis or some of the others, the amount of money that we spend on piloting and then not moving to the next step of where do you go with it, if we think about this as successive change, let's learn from those that came before us. If it's the project, the generation, I think that'll help carry us forward to stop wasting money in piloting and just getting forward to try and making a change in the landscape. And I hope that as folks are making their way back, that we all remember one thing, which is we don't have a funding problem for restoration, because we have 3 global conventions that were established to help us try and track and overcome the problem that was agreed to in 1992. There are billions of dollars a year spent on land change. What we need to do is try and get better outcomes from the investments and the everyday decisions that are being made that bring us towards the outcomes that we as societies and people need. So I think if we can take opportunities, there's examples in the State of the Forest report that's being launched today for Canada, comes out every year. There's an upcoming conference in Portugal in 2023 that's encouraging on fire and landscape governance that's coming up. I think trying to exchange outside of our regions and through things like the network, the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration, or some of the local networks that many of the people on the stage are creating, I think those are the things that are going to help us overcome some of the setbacks and realize that we actually just have a big opportunity. We just need to find a way to harness all the energy that goes into land use change every day.
Thank you for this quick round of views about how to, best practices, of course, but also how to ensure that things are scaled up, are long-term sustainable, and it has to do a lot with funding, of course, but integrating these programs into policies, but from the local level up to the national, correct? So there is funding allocated for it, and then all of the actors that support these actions that we have heard of today are also in line with this common effort, whether it is academia or investors and, of course, local communities, indigenous peoples, and so forth. I want to thank the panelists so much for sharing your experiences. Please, a round of applause to all of them. I hope the audience find time to talk to all of them, and I'm sure, and to exchange experiences and knowledge. And enjoy your month. Is it Monday? I'm a bit lost in time. Yes? Okay, good. I've been here for over 15 days, so. Great, enjoy COP.